The sirens had been wailing for 3 hours straight. News vans lined Memorial Hospital's entrance like predators circling wounded prey, their satellite dishes reaching toward a sky that seemed to mirror the city's rage with heavy, threatening clouds. Families clutched photographs of loved ones, their tears mixing with the first drops of rain that began to fall on the concrete steps where protesters had gathered since dawn. Justice for Marcus. The chant rose and fell like a tide, carried by voices hoarse from hours of shouting. Justice for our community. Signs bobbed above the crowd, some hastily scrawled on cardboard, others professionally printed, all bearing the same message of outrage and demand for accountability. Inside the hospital's administrative wing, Dr. Patricia Williams pressed her palm against the cool glass of her office window, watching the chaos unfold below. 23 years she had worked to build this emergency department into one of the city's finest. Now, in the span of a single morning, it all threatened to crumble. The story had begun 12 hours earlier, when Marcus Thompson clocked in for what should have been a routine night shift. At 28, Marcus had already earned a reputation as one of the most skilled paramedics in the city's emergency medical services. His colleagues respected his quick thinking under pressure, his gentle bedside manner with frightened patients, and his unwavering dedication to saving lives regardless of who needed help. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. Cardiac arrest. Elderly male. Apartment complex on the east side. Marcus and his partner, Jake Morrison, had responded within minutes, their ambulance cutting through the empty streets with lights blazing and sirens echoing off sleeping buildings. ETA 2 minutes. Marcus had radioed to dispatch, already mentally preparing for the critical care protocols that could mean the difference between life and death. He checked his equipment one final time, ensuring everything was in perfect order. They found Harold Peterson, 73 years old, collapsed in his bedroom. His wife, Margaret, stood in the doorway wringing her hands, her face pale with terror. "He just grabbed his chest and fell," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own ragged breathing. Marcus moved with practiced efficiency, dropping to his knees beside the unconscious man. His fingers found no pulse at Harold's wrist, then at his neck. No pulse, no breathing. He announced to Jake, who was already unpacking the defibrillator, "Starting CPR." The next 20 minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance between life and death. Marcus's hands pumped rhythmically against Harold's chest, counting compressions aloud, while Jake prepared medications and managed the airway. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Marcus counted, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool night air flowing through the open apartment door. "We've got a rhythm," Jake called out, watching the monitor's green line jump with signs of life. Harold's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding his features as he tried to understand what had happened. "Sir, you're going to be okay," Marcus said, his voice calm and reassuring despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "You had a heart attack, but we've got you stabilized. We're taking you to Memorial Hospital right now." The transport to the hospital proceeded smoothly. Harold remained conscious and responsive, his vital signs improving with each passing minute. Marcus continued monitoring, adjusting oxygen levels and maintaining IV access, while Jake navigated through the pre-dawn traffic. Everything indicated a successful resuscitation, a life saved through quick action and skilled intervention. They arrived at Memorial Hospital at 3:42 a.m., where the emergency department team took over Harold's care. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, praised Marcus and Jake for their excellent work in the field. "Textbook resuscitation," she told them as they prepared to leave for their next call. "You two probably added years to this man's life. But Karen Mitchell had been watching from the nurse's station, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. At 51, Karen had worked in various departments throughout Memorial Hospital for nearly 2 decades, leaving a trail of complaints and conflicts wherever she went. Her colleagues had learned to navigate around her volatile temperament and her tendency to find fault with everyone else's work. Marcus had encountered Karen before, during previous patient transfers. She had always made comments under her breath, questioning his procedures or suggesting that some people didn't belong in emergency medicine. He had tried to ignore her behavior, focusing instead on his patients and his duty to provide the best possible care. What Marcus didn't know was that Karen had been passed over for a promotion to nursing supervisor the previous month, a position that had gone to a younger, more qualified candidate. She had filed a grievance with the hospital administration, claiming discrimination based on her age, but the complaint had been dismissed after investigation. Her resentment had been simmering ever since, looking for a target on which to focus her anger. Harold Peterson spent the next several hours in the emergency department, undergoing tests and receiving treatment for his heart condition. His condition remained stable, and doctors were optimistic about his recovery. Margaret stayed by his side, holding his hand and whispering words of encouragement. At 6:15 a.m., however, Harold suffered another massive heart attack. This time, despite the immediate response of the hospital's cardiac team, the damage was too severe. Harold Peterson died at 6:43 a.m., surrounded by medical professionals who had fought desperately to save him. Karen Mitchell saw her opportunity. While the medical team was still working to understand what had caused Harold's second cardiac event, she slipped away to a quiet corner of the hospital and pulled out her cell phone. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was professional and calm. This is Karen Mitchell. I'm a registered nurse at Memorial Hospital, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. I need to report a case of medical malpractice. A black paramedic administered incorrect medications to a patient earlier tonight, and the patient just died. I witnessed the whole thing. The dispatcher asked for details, and Karen provided them with convincing precision. She claimed that Marcus had given Harold the wrong dosage of epinephrine, that he had performed CPR incorrectly, and that he had ignored standard protocols. Her voice carried the authority of someone with medical training, making her accusations sound credible and urgent. The patient might still be alive if that paramedic had done his job properly. Karen continued, warming to her fabricated story. Someone needs to investigate this before he kills someone else. Within an hour, Karen's false report had triggered a cascade of official responses. The hospital's risk management department launched an immediate investigation. The city's emergency medical services suspended Marcus, pending a review of his actions. Local news outlets picked up the story, reporting that a paramedic was under investigation for allegedly causing a patient's death through negligence. Marcus learned about the accusations when his supervisor called him at home, waking him from the few hours of sleep he had managed to grab between shifts. Marcus, I need you to come in immediately. Captain Rodriguez's voice was tight with stress. There's been a complaint filed against you regarding the Peterson case. The Peterson case. Marcus sat up in bed, instantly alert. Harold Peterson. We saved his life. Dr. Chen even complimented our work. He died this morning, Captain Rodriguez said quietly. And someone has accused you of malpractice. We need to talk. The meeting at headquarters was a nightmare that seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus found himself facing a panel of administrators, investigators, and union representatives, all asking questions about his actions during Harold Peterson's treatment. They reviewed his medications, his techniques, his decision-making process. Marcus answered every question truthfully and completely, confident that the facts would speak for themselves. The accusation claims you administered the wrong dose of epinephrine, one investigator said, consulting a thick folder of documents. Can you walk us through your medication administration? I followed standard ACLS protocols exactly, Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the churning in his stomach. 1 milligram of epinephrine, administered intravenously every 3 to 5 minutes during the cardiac arrest. I documented everything in my patient care report. But the investigation would take time, and, in the court of public opinion, time was a luxury Marcus didn't have. By afternoon, protesters had begun gathering outside the hospital, demanding answers about Harold Peterson's death. Social media exploded with hashtags and angry posts. Local news stations ran Marcus's photograph alongside headlines about the investigation, turning him into a symbol of alleged medical incompetence. The hospital's board of directors held an emergency meeting that evening, trying to manage the growing crisis. Dr. Williams fought to keep the emergency department operating normally, but the protests were affecting staff morale and patient access. Several nurses had called in sick, unwilling to cross the picket lines that had formed outside the main entrance. We need to consider temporarily closing emergency services, Board Chairman Robert Hayes suggested during the heated discussion. The situation is becoming a public safety issue. If we close the emergency department, people will die, Dr. Williams argued passionately. This is exactly what happened at City General 5 years ago. They never fully recovered from the closure. But the pressure was too intense to ignore. By the end of the week, Memorial Hospital announced that it would temporarily suspend emergency services while the investigation continued. Ambulances would be diverted to other facilities, leaving the community without its closest emergency care option. Marcus watched the news coverage from his apartment, feeling the weight of an entire community's anger pressing down on his shoulders. His phone rang constantly, with calls from reporters seeking comments, union representatives offering support, and friends expressing their disbelief at the accusations. He ignored most of them, spending his days replaying the events of that night over and over in his mind, searching for anything he might have done differently. His partner Jake stood by him without question, providing detailed statements to investigators about Marcus's professional conduct during Harold Peterson's treatment. Marcus did everything by the book, Jake insisted to anyone who would listen. I've worked with him for 3 years, and I've never seen him make a mistake. He's one of the best paramedics I know. Meanwhile, Karen Mitchell continued her campaign of whispered accusations and carefully planted doubts. She spoke to reporters off the record, always careful to present herself as a concerned healthcare professional, rather than someone with a personal agenda. She attended hospital staff meetings, shaking her head sadly when Marcus's name came up, and making comments about the need for better oversight of emergency medical services. The community's response grew more intense with each passing day. Families shared stories of loved ones who had been saved by emergency medical services, contrasting them with Harold Peterson's tragic death. Churches held prayer vigils. Community leaders called for reforms in emergency medical training and accountability. Mrs. Peterson, Harold's widow, found herself caught in the middle of the controversy. Reporters camped outside her home, seeking statements about her husband's death and her feelings about the paramedic who had tried to save him. She had watched Marcus work that night, had seen the care and dedication he brought to helping Harold. But the grief and confusion of losing her husband made it difficult to think clearly about what had happened. 3 weeks into the crisis, the Medical Review Board finally completed its preliminary investigation. Dr. James Foster, the state's chief medical examiner, spent hours reviewing Marcus's patient care reports, the hospital's treatment records, and Harold Peterson's complete medical history. What he found contradicted Karen Mitchell's accusations completely. Marcus had followed every protocol correctly. His medication dosages were appropriate and properly documented. His CPR technique had been textbook perfect. Most importantly, Harold Peterson's second heart attack had been caused by a massive coronary thrombosis that was completely unrelated to his initial treatment. The paramedics' actions were not only appropriate, but exemplary. Dr. Foster wrote in his preliminary report, "Mr. Peterson's initial survival was directly attributable to the quick and skilled intervention of the EMS team. His subsequent death was caused by an unrelated cardiac event that could not have been prevented by any reasonable medical intervention." As investigators dug deeper into the case, they began uncovering troubling inconsistencies in Karen Mitchell's story. Her account of events didn't match the documented timeline. Her description of Marcus's supposed errors contradicted the medical evidence. Most damaging of all, security camera footage from the hospital showed that Karen had been nowhere near the emergency department when Harold Peterson was being treated. Detective Lisa Park, who had been assigned to investigate the case, requested additional records from Karen's employment history. What she found painted a picture of a troubled employee with a pattern of complaints and conflicts. Karen had been reprimanded multiple times for unprofessional behavior, had filed numerous grievances against colleagues and supervisors, and had a documented history of making unsubstantiated allegations. "We have a problem," Detective Park told her supervisor. "This complaint appears to be completely fabricated. The nurse who made the accusation has serious credibility issues, and her story doesn't match any of the physical evidence." The investigation's findings began to leak to the media, creating a new narrative that was dramatically different from the initial story. Marcus Thompson wasn't a negligent paramedic who had caused a patient's death. He was a dedicated professional who had been falsely accused by a colleague with a grudge. Karen Mitchell realized that her web of lies was unraveling. She attempted to modify her story, claiming that she had been mistaken about some details, but insisting that Marcus had still provided substandard care. Her credibility, however, had been irreparably damaged by the revelation that she had made false statements to investigators. The community's anger, which had been focused on Marcus for weeks, began to shift toward Karen and the hospital administration that had suspended him without conducting a thorough investigation first. Protesters who had demanded Marcus's prosecution now called for his reinstatement and for accountability from those who had wrongly accused him. The hospital board called an emergency meeting to address the growing crisis. Dr. Williams presented the medical review board's findings to the assembled members, her voice carrying a mixture of vindication and frustration. "Marcus Thompson is an exemplary paramedic who saved Harold Peterson's life," she declared. "He deserves not only to be reinstated, but to receive a formal apology from this institution." Board Chairman Hayes, who had initially supported the suspension, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of admitting the hospital's error. "We acted based on the information available at the time," he said defensively. "When serious allegations are made, we have a responsibility to investigate. You have a responsibility to investigate fairly and thoroughly." Dr. Williams shot back. "Not to destroy a man's reputation based on the word of a single disgruntled employee with a documented history of making false accusations." The meeting grew heated as board members debated their response to the crisis. Some argued for quietly reinstating Marcus and hoping the controversy would fade. Others insisted that they needed to take dramatic action to restore the community's trust. Outside the conference room, protesters could be heard chanting Marcus's name and demanding justice. Margaret Peterson, Harold's widow, requested a meeting with hospital administrators. She had spent weeks struggling with grief and confusion, trying to understand what had happened to her husband and whether someone was to blame for his death. The medical review board's findings had provided her with answers, but they came with the painful realization that she had been caught up in someone else's lie. "I want to speak with Marcus Thompson," she told Dr. Williams during their private meeting. "I need to thank him for trying to save Harold's life, and I need to apologize for the pain this has caused him." The meeting between Margaret Peterson and Marcus Thompson took place in a quiet conference room at Memorial Hospital, with Dr. Williams serving as a witness. Margaret, a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes, looked fragile but determined as she faced the man who had fought to save her husband's life. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice wavering with emotion. "I watched you work on Harold that night. I saw how hard you tried, how much you cared. I'm so sorry that someone used my husband's death to hurt you." Marcus, who had maintained his composure through weeks of public scrutiny and professional humiliation, felt tears welling in his eyes. "Mrs. Peterson, I'm sorry we couldn't save him. We did everything we could, but sometimes it's not enough." "You gave him 3 more hours," Margaret replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. "3 more hours to tell me he loved me, to say goodbye to our children. That was a gift I wouldn't have had without you." The public revelation of the investigation's true findings created a media firestorm that was even more intense than the original accusations. National news outlets picked up the story, turning it into a symbol of how quickly false accusations could destroy lives and how prejudice could influence perceptions of professional competence. Karen Mitchell found herself facing not only professional consequences, but potential criminal charges for filing a false police report and interfering with a medical investigation. The state nursing board launched its own investigation into her conduct, with the likely outcome being the revocation of her license. During her final interview with investigators, Karen's facade of righteous concern finally crumbled. "He shouldn't be working here," she said bitterly, no longer bothering to hide her prejudice. "People like him don't belong in positions of responsibility. I don't care what your investigation says." Detective Parks stared at Karen across the interview table, disgusted by the woman's refusal to acknowledge the harm she had caused. "Ms. Mitchell, you filed a false police report that destroyed a man's reputation and disrupted emergency medical services for an entire community. People could have died because ambulances were being diverted away from Memorial Hospital." The hospital board held a public meeting to address the crisis and announce their response. The auditorium was packed with community members, hospital staff, city officials, and media representatives. The tension in the room was palpable as Chairman Hayes took the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional responsibility, "we are here tonight to address a grave injustice that has occurred within our hospital system. After a thorough investigation, we have determined that the accusations made against paramedic Marcus Thompson were completely false and without merit." The announcement was met with a mixture of cheers and angry shouts from the audience. Some people applauded the hospital's admission of error, while others demanded to know why it had taken so long to reach this conclusion. "Marcus Thompson is not only innocent of any wrongdoing," Hayes continued, "but he is an exemplary medical professional who saved Harold Peterson's life through skillful and appropriate emergency care. We deeply regret the pain and professional damage he has suffered as a result of false accusations." Marcus was invited to address the crowd. He walked slowly to the podium, his uniform crisp and his bearing dignified despite everything he had endured. The auditorium fell silent as he looked out at the sea of faces. some friendly, some still skeptical, all waiting to hear what he had to say. 3 weeks ago, I responded to an emergency call to help save a man's life. Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. That's what I do every day, and it's what I'll continue to do as long as I'm able. I don't do it for recognition or praise. I do it because everyone deserves a chance to live, to spend more time with their families, to see another sunrise. He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. What happened to me over the past 3 weeks was painful and unfair. But what hurt me most was not the damage to my reputation or my career. It was knowing that emergency services were disrupted, that people who needed help might not get it as quickly as they should because of lies someone told about me. The audience was completely quiet now, hanging on his every word. I don't want to see anyone else go through what I've experienced. Not just paramedics or doctors or nurses, but anyone who's trying to do their job honestly and professionally. We need to be better than this. We need to demand truth and fairness, not jump to conclusions based on prejudice or personal grudges. Marcus looked directly at Margaret Peterson, who was sitting in the front row. Mrs. Peterson, thank you for your courage in speaking the truth about what happened that night. Your husband was lucky to have someone who loved him as much as you did. The hospital board announced a series of reforms designed to prevent similar incidents in the future. They established new protocols for investigating complaints against medical staff, created an independent review board to oversee disciplinary actions, and implemented mandatory bias training for all employees. Karen Mitchell was terminated from her position at Memorial Hospital and faced criminal charges for filing a false police report. The state nursing board revoked her license permanently, citing not only the false accusations, but also her pattern of unprofessional conduct throughout her career. She would never work in healthcare again. The emergency department at Memorial Hospital reopened with great fanfare, and Marcus Thompson was not only reinstated, but promoted to training supervisor for the city's emergency medical services. His first assignment was to develop new protocols for handling complaints and investigations, ensuring that future accusations would be handled with greater care and objectivity. 6 months later, Marcus received the city's highest honor for public service, recognizing not only his professional excellence, but also his grace under pressure during the crisis. The ceremony was held at the same hospital where he had been falsely accused, with Margaret Peterson presenting the award. "Heroes aren't just people who save lives," she said as she handed him the medal. "They're people who maintain their integrity when everything seems to be falling apart around them." Marcus Thompson is both kinds of hero. As Marcus looked out at the crowd of supporters, colleagues, and community members who had gathered to honor him, he thought about the long journey from that terrible night when Harold Peterson had his first heart attack to this moment of vindication and recognition. The experience had been painful, but it had also revealed the strength of his community and the power of truth to overcome prejudice and lies. The protests were over. The news vans had moved on to other stories. Memorial Hospital's emergency department was busier than ever, serving a community that had learned valuable lessons about justice, fairness, and the importance of supporting those who dedicate their lives to helping others. Marcus returned to work the next day, responding to emergency calls with the same dedication and skill he had always brought to his job. But now, he carried with him not only the satisfaction of serving his community, but also the knowledge that truth and justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail over hatred and lies. The false accusation had tried to destroy him, but instead, it had made him stronger and brought his community together in ways that nobody could have predicted. In the end, that was perhaps the most powerful victory of all.